In 1998, at Sotheby's auction house in New York, a small collection of letters sold for $74,000. They weren't signed Albert Einstein. They were signed Almar, a private nickname, a secret name, used only in private correspondence between the most famous scientist alive and a woman almost nobody had ever heard of. Her name was Margarita Konenkova, Russian-born, married to a sculptor, living in New York during the final, most dangerous years of the Manhattan Project. The letters reveal a real, years-long relationship between her and Einstein during the exact period America was racing to build the atomic bomb. That alone would be a fascinating footnote in Einstein's biography. A quiet romance in his final decade. But 4 years before those letters ever became public, a retired Soviet intelligence general published a memoir, making a claim that turned this from a love story into something far stranger, a claim historians have since called seriously into question, but one that's never fully gone away. He claimed Margarita Konenkova had been sent by Soviet intelligence to get close to Einstein and extract what he knew about the atomic bomb. Some of the world's most respected physicists publicly, furiously denied it. And there's a second set of letters, ones almost nobody talks about, hidden for decades in a place you wouldn't expect, that adds an entirely different layer to this story. So which is closer to the truth? A lonely, aging genius who found real love in his final years? Or something that reads, on the surface, disturbingly close to Cold War espionage? Stay with me, because even the people who've spent decades researching this still don't fully agree, and what the evidence actually shows might surprise you either way. To understand this story, you need to understand how these two people ever crossed paths at all. Margarita Konenkova was born in Russia in 1895. Before immigrating, she had trained as a lawyer, one of relatively few women in that field at the time. She married Sergei Konenkov, a well-regarded Russian sculptor, and in 1923 the couple moved to New York, where Sergei built a respected career creating portrait busts of prominent Americans. In 1935, Sergei Konenkov received a commission that would change everything. He was asked to sculpt a bust of Albert Einstein, who by then was living at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Margarita accompanied her husband to the sittings. Einstein at this point was in his mid-50s. His second wife, Elsa, had died the previous year. He was, by most biographical accounts, profoundly isolated, famous beyond almost anyone alive, but personally lonely in a way his fame only seemed to deepen. Margarita was in her 40s, intelligent, cultured, fluent in multiple languages, and, by numerous accounts from those who knew her, magnetic in a way that drew people toward her easily. According to the later published letters, the relationship between Einstein and Margarita developed gradually over these sittings, and continued for years afterward, well past the point where the sculpture itself was finished. This is where the story could simply end. An aging widower and a charming woman, a quiet affair, nothing more. But there's a detail that makes this far more complicated. And it has to do with timing. By the early 1940s, the United States was deep into the Manhattan Project, the secret effort to build the atomic bomb. Einstein himself wasn't directly involved in the project's classified work. His 1939 letter to President Roosevelt had helped launch it, but Einstein's own left-leaning political history meant he was actually denied the security clearance needed to work on the bomb directly. But here's what most people don't know. Einstein still had close, ongoing relationships with numerous scientists who were working directly on the Manhattan Project. He remained a towering figure in the physics community. Scientists visited him, corresponded with him, discussed ideas with him, sometimes ideas that touched even indirectly on the physics underlying the bomb's development. And it was during exactly this period, the early to mid-1940s, that Einstein's relationship with Margarita Konenkova deepened significantly. According to the letters, the two met regularly, sometimes at a cabin near Saranac Lake in upstate New York, where Einstein vacationed. In some letters, Einstein refers to a small boat he named, according to some translations after her, a private detail suggesting real emotional intimacy, not a casual arrangement. The letters are, by most accounts of those who've read them, genuinely tender. Einstein writes about missing her, about looking forward to their time together. This doesn't read like professional correspondence. It reads like real, personal longing. Here's the detail that complicates everything. Margarita Konenkova maintained documented connections to Soviet diplomatic circles in New York throughout this period. In 1945, the same year the war ended, the same year the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Margarita Konenkova abruptly returned to the Soviet Union. Why leave then? Why leave at all after years built in New York? This is where the story stops being simply a romance, at least on the surface. Production note: Show Library of Congress building, archive imagery. Before we get to the spy accusation, because that's what most people who know this story focus on, there's a piece almost nobody covers, and it matters. The 9 letters sold at Sotheby's in 1998 weren't the only ones that existed. There was a second, separate set 6 additional letters that Margarita Konenkova had given years earlier to a neighbor and friend named Marjorie Bishop, along with an instruction: burn them. Bishop never did. Instead, these letters eventually made their way into the Library of Congress where they sat, effectively sealed from public research access for decades. They weren't fully available to researchers until 2019, more than 60 years after Einstein's death. Why does this matter? Because it means our understanding of this relationship has actually kept expanding in recent years, not staying frozen in 1998. Researchers who've reviewed this second batch describe letters that reinforce the same emotional pattern as the first: personal, affectionate, consistent with a real relationship rather than a purely constructed one. But this second batch also gives historians more material to examine Konenkova's own words about her life in New York, including her ongoing, very real efforts to secure something else entirely: permission to return home. Which brings us to the explanation for her Soviet ties that's actually the best documented one, and it's less dramatic than you'd expect. In 1994, a book titled Special Tasks was published, credited to a retired Soviet intelligence general named Pavel Sudoplatov. It's worth being precise about what this book actually was. Sudoplatov didn't write it in the traditional sense. It was compiled by 2 American journalists, Gerald and Leona Schechter, based on interviews conducted with the elderly Sudoplatov in Russia. Historians who've examined the book closely, including researchers at the Library of Congress, have generally described it as significantly flawed, citing sloppy sourcing and an apparent over-reliance on Sudoplatov's own unverified recollections decades after the events in question. In the book, Sudoplatov claimed Margarita Konenkova had been recruited as a Soviet intelligence asset, and that her relationship with Einstein was, at least in part, a deliberate operation. The book made a similarly serious claim about J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, suggesting he had knowingly or unknowingly passed information to Soviet intelligence. That specific claim was directly and publicly disputed by physicists Hans Bethe, Robert Wilson, and Victor Weisskopf, all of whom had worked closely with Oppenheimer and knew him personally. In a joint letter to the PBS program McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, calling it baseless and inconsistent with the historical record. Their rebuttal focused specifically on the Oppenheimer allegation. But combined with the book's already shaky sourcing, it cast serious doubt over the reliability of its other claims too, including everything it said about Konenkova. So, here's the honest, difficult question. How much of this should we actually believe? The evidence points in genuinely different directions, depending on which piece you're examining. Let's look at what actually supports the espionage theory and what argues against it, including the explanation historians now consider best documented. What supports it? Margarita Konenkova's ties to Soviet officials in New York are real, not speculative. This isn't disputed by historians on any side of the debate. Her return to the USSR in 1945, at the exact close of the war, has drawn genuine scrutiny. Sergei Konenkov himself returned to the Soviet Union shortly after as well. What argues against it, or complicates it significantly? Here's the best documented explanation for Konenkova's Soviet consular contact, and it has nothing to do with espionage. According to Library of Congress research, Konenkova spent years in a genuine practical negotiation with the Soviet vice-consul, Pavel Mikhailov, simply trying to secure the paperwork she needed to legally return home. As part of this ordinary bureaucratic relationship, she was reportedly asked to introduce Mikhailov to Einstein, socially a far more mundane request than a formal espionage tasking, and one grounded in actual archival correspondence rather than a memoir written decades after the fact. Einstein, as established earlier, did not have security clearance and wasn't part of the classified Manhattan Project work. Several historians point out he simply didn't have access to the kind of specific technical information that would make him a high-value espionage target the way Oppenheimer would have been. The letters themselves, both batches read as genuinely personal and emotionally intimate to the historians who've reviewed them, not as the kind of correspondence typically associated with a purely transactional intelligence operation. And then there's the source itself. A book with acknowledged sourcing problems, compiled from one elderly man's decades-old recollections, whose claims about a different, verifiable scientist were already shown to be false by people who knew that scientist personally. The most honest conclusion historians have reached is this: Konenkova's documented Soviet consular contact most likely had a far more ordinary explanation securing her own return home than the dramatic espionage narrative later attached to her story. That doesn't make the relationship any less genuinely emotionally real. It just means the spy framing rests on considerably weaker ground than the romance itself. What nobody has ever produced, not in 1994, not since, is a verified Soviet intelligence document confirming a formal operation specifically targeting Einstein through Konenkova. Without that, the espionage claim remains a historically disputed accusation from a poorly sourced book, not a proven case. Margarita Konenkova lived out the remainder of her life in the Soviet Union, largely out of public view. She died in Moscow in 1980, 25 years after Einstein. For decades, the relationship remained essentially unknown, outside a small circle. It only came to light because Margarita's own family eventually decided to sell the first batch of letters, where they were purchased, according to reports at the time, by an anonymous buyer for the American Institute of Physics Center for History of Physics. Reading them today, both batches, historians describe a genuine emotional complexity. A lonely, aging Einstein, grieving the loss of his second wife, finding real companionship with a woman who was, at the very same time, quietly working to secure her own way home. Einstein himself never publicly commented on any suspicion of espionage during his lifetime because, as far as any surviving record shows, he was never confronted with the accusation at all. It only surfaced decades after both of them were dead. He died in 1955, apparently believing this had simply been one of the genuine, meaningful relationships of his later years. So where does this actually leave us? We know the letters are real, both sets. We know the relationship was real, and by all accounts, emotionally genuine on Einstein's side. We know Margarita Konenkova had real documented ties to Soviet officials in New York, and we now know the best documented reason. For those ties was her own attempt to go home, not a mission to spy on America's most famous scientist. We also know a poorly sourced 1994 book turned this quiet, human story into a Cold War espionage legend, one that top physicists partly discredited, and that archival research since has continued to complicate. None of these pieces individually closes the case completely. Together, they form one of the more genuinely layered footnotes in Einstein's entire life story. Maybe that's the most honest place to leave it. A brilliant, lonely man in his final decade of life. A woman who loved him, and who was also, quietly, trying to build her way back home. Two things that, for once, don't actually have to contradict each other. The letters are preserved today, available for researchers to study. But the question that turned this into legend, whether Margarita Konenkova was ever truly a spy, rests on far shakier ground than most retellings admit. Albert Einstein, 1879–1955. Even his most private relationship still keeps a secret, just not the one most people think.